The issue of false accusations has been the subject of heated and ongoing debate in both online and political discussions for years now. Online movements that have arisen in recent years for people to share their experiences with sexual assault and rape have in turn been met with no shortage of people coming to question their stories, the validity of their claims, and their intent in making them. And I wanted to talk a bit more about this skepticism, which has resulted in what I can only describe as an anti-accuser stance. But first I want to clarify something. I'm not interested in claiming that these false accusations never happen. I know that they do, and it's a huge miscarriage of justice whenever someone is tried for something they didn't do. What I really want to do in this video is set the record straight on some pretty misleading statistics I've seen floating around regarding how common they are, and the greater cultural attitude that this stems from, and the harm that results. So, let's see the data and how people use it. While doing some preliminary research for this video, I stumbled across the men's rights subreddit, a community with over 350,000 members. It was there that I found this post complaining about the believe the victim's bullshit narrative and taking issue with the claim that only 2% of accusations end up being false, before going on to cite some sources that provide a much higher percentage. And this was my first introduction to a figure that I saw crop up time and time again while researching this video, the claim that up to 40% of accusations of sexual assault turned out to be false. As this poster describes it, most allegations are made by women against men. I was an outlier, so it is very much a gendered issue. I'd rather believe a liar than a rapist, but those lies ruin and take lives. People, men, kill themselves because of this, and the liars aren't held accountable by the law. Men lose their jobs, their friends, their families, and possibly their future dreams, all because of these lies. Nearly 40% of these accusations are false. That means 2 out of 5 allegations are false. And that's only with sexual violence. We're not even talking about sexual misconduct or sexual harassment. And I see this statistic pop up a lot in these discussions, to the point that I believe it serves as the basis for why false accusations are thought to be so common in the first place. This particular Redditor gets the number from a Washington Times article, which describes the one academic study that arrived at this conclusion. But they're hardly alone in that regard. I found a shocking amount of articles that all cite the 40% statistic provided by one academic study. Let's have a look at all of them. So here's one from the Washington Times. Here it is again on the AP News. Here it is from a domestic violence watchdog called Radar. Here's one from Save Services, the Baltimore Sun, and one posted by Mississippi lawyers. And look, of course there's nothing wrong with citing statistics to back up your point, but when so many of these people's arguments depend on this statistic from one academic study, let's just say there's a lot depending on that one study. So let's take a look. The study in question was conducted by one Kanin, a man whose work is mentioned in a lot of false accusation discourse, and looked at reports of forcible rape over a 9-year period in a small Midwestern town of 70,000 people. It was found that out of 109 reported forcible rape cases, 45 were determined false, amounting to 41% of the total reports. So that proves it. The people citing this statistic were right all along, right? Well, not exactly. Kanin went out of his way to categorize each of these reports into 3 different motivations for making them, and they break down in a pretty interesting way. The most common reason, accounting for 27 reports, a whopping 56% of these false accusations, was the need for an alibi. In fact, in all but 3 of the cases in this category, the alibi was needed for a possible pregnancy. The other 3 false reports were informed by things like not wanting to be seen as promiscuous, needing medication for an STD that her boyfriend had given her, and covering up a fight that would jeopardize a custody hearing. The second most common reason, accounting for 12 of the accusations, or 27%, is the one that many of the anti-accuser advocates are focused on, the desire for revenge against a man these women felt had wronged them. And then coming in last with 8 accusations, or 18% of the total cases, Were the reports driven by a need for attention or sympathy from people close to the complainant, be it their mother who they were fighting with or a therapist whose attention they desired? Now, these may seem like some pretty weak reasons to ruin an innocent man's life, as this Reddit post puts it, and I would agree, but here's where it gets interesting. As Kanin points out, half of the reports made with an alibi motive didn't actually name a perpetrator, they just claimed that a rape had occurred and left it there. It's the same with the sympathy classification. In this category, none of the reports named a perpetrator, which obviously tracks with sympathy and attention being the driving motivational forces in these instances, rather than spite towards any particular person. This means that out of the 45 total reports deemed false in Kanin's study, there are 21 or 22 that never actually name a perpetrator. That's almost half of the total false reports. If we wanted to look at how many of these false accusations directly affected men, we would see that it adds up to 23 or 24, which amounts for 22% of the 109 total accusations made within the 9-year period that Kanin studied. But look at how it's interpreted by this person on Reddit. Men lose their jobs, their friends, their families, and possibly their future dreams, all because of these lies. Nearly 40% of these accusations are false. That means 2 out of 5 allegations are false. This person is spinning the number in such a way that it doesn't refer to 40% of the accusations being false, but 40% of accusations towards men, which isn't what the study says. I can only assume that this person never bothered to actually read the study they pulled these figures from, and instead relied on easy-to-digest articles that popped up when they googled false accusations common. Maybe if they had read this study for themselves, they would have noticed how simply outdated it is. A lot of the articles that cover this study like to go out of their way to highlight the 9-year time frame it took place in, as if to highlight that this makes it more robust. But they never tell you what 9 years those are. This Washington Times article even goes so far as to cite Kanin's findings alongside a 2017 book, as if to make it sound really modern and up to date. But this isn't actually the case. When you go out of your way to actually read the study, you'll see that it took place between the years 1978 to 1987. Sorry, Rowan Scarborough, you might be a few years off there. As of me recording this, that's over 40 years ago. And when it comes to a topic as heavily scrutinized as rape accusations, it's important to remember that cultural attitudes towards rape and what rape is have drastically changed in recent years, let alone decades. And I wanted to highlight an example of this that I found especially pertinent. In 1978, the same year that this study began, the trial of Oregon versus Rideout garnered international media attention. This was the first trial in US history where a man, John Rideout, was charged with raping his wife, Greta, while they still lived together. This had previously been impossible. A clause in Oregon's rape law provided husbands with immunity to rape accusations from their wives, an exemption called marital privilege. This exemption was only removed in the year prior to this case, in 1977. John won the case, by the way, thanks to his lawyer Charles Burt raising questions as to Greta's sexual history and reputation, which he described as a very serious sexual problem. This is an important cultural attitude that must be considered when examining Kanin's study. The negative perception of rape complainants has played a major role in inhibiting justice being done where necessary, time and time again. Because of the distrust of Greta's sexual history being spread by the legal opposition, John was able to walk free and commit further rapes for which he's now serving prison time. Justice wasn't done in the Rideout case because of the culture in which it occurred. A culture that disregarded the experience of victims due to broadly held biases against them, or people like them. This same culture is one in which Kanin began his study, and we must keep that in mind when looking at how the falsity of a rape report was determined. Looking at the methodology of Kanin's study, we can begin to see how those same cultural biases once again come into play when examining these reports. So how did Kanin go about determining each case as false or true? In the study, he highlights that each report was only deemed false if the person making the report, the alleged victim themselves, recanted their statements and claimed that no rape had actually occurred. This information was then filed by a detective and reported to Kanin to use in his study. As pointed out by David Lisak, an associate professor of psychology at the University of Massachusetts, Kanin relies on no other means of evaluating the information provided to him by the police department in determining each report as false. He simply follows the word of the detective filing the information. And you may be thinking, but the complainant themselves recanted. Why would they withdraw their report if it actually did happen? And this is where we have to examine the anti-victim approach that many police departments have historically engaged in. Kanin describes how each complainant was made a very serious offer of a polygraph test, and at first you may think that there's nothing wrong with this, or that you only have to be worried if you are lying. But that all hinges on the foregone conclusion that polygraphs or lie detector tests are a reliable science, when they're just not. They measure physical responses to questions, and if you can't see why someone reporting a traumatic experience would be anxious at being asked about it, I don't really know what to say to you. I mean, polygraph tests are so unreliable, so hostile towards complainants of rape, that they've since been outlawed across many nations. But that's only a symptom of a greater problem, and that's of a culture of hostility towards alleged victims of rape. Their emotional, mental, and often physical needs are very often disregarded during investigations, to the point that the investigative process has been referred to as the second rape due to how violating it is. Kanin does appear to be aware of this fact and attempts to account for it before showing the results of the study, but listen to how he describes it. A possible objection to these recantations concerns their validity. Rape recantations could be the result of the complainant's desire to avoid a second assault at the hands of the police. Rather than proceed with the real charge of rape, the argument goes, these women withdrew their accusations to avoid the trauma of a police investigation. He then goes on to explain why he doesn't believe this was the case, stating that, with very few exceptions, these complainants were suspect at the time of the complaint or within a day or two after charging. These recantations did not follow prolonged periods of investigation and interrogation that would constitute anything approximating a second assault. Now, the problem here is assuming that complainants only recant after a lengthy investigative process, which isn't true. In fact, research has demonstrated that the possibility of an invasive second assault is enough motivation for many people to recant. A report written by an ex-police sergeant, Joanne Archambault, even directly names polygraph tests as one of these invasive procedures that causes people to falsely recant. Now remember, every single complainant in Kanin's study was made a very serious offer to be polygraphed. This is an institutional failure that creates a feedback loop, wherein the correct way of dealing with these cases is actively hostile to victims. And because of that, false recantations can and do occur. And then those false recantations go on to shape the biases of the police handling those reports, and the process repeats itself. Kanin says it himself. These complainants were suspect at the time of the complaint or within a day or two, and then later, none of the detectives believed that an incident of false recantation had occurred. So, while it's possible that every recantation was true, there's an even greater possibility that the system of handling these complaints, which has been proven to be ineffective, hostile, and invasive to victims, inflated the number of false reports by encouraging these recantations. This is something with many historical precedents, which I now wanted to get into. False Reports is a paper co-written by Alan Berkowitz, Joanne Archambault, and Kimberly Lonsway of End Violence Against Women International, and cites several more academically rigorous studies that delve into the issue of false rape reports and returns with some very significant findings. For example, a study of 2,059 rape reports over a 2-year period found that only 7% of these reports, 140, to be false. This is described as particularly noteworthy because, and I quote, "a number of measures were taken to protect the reliability and validity of the research. First, all participating law enforcement agencies were provided training and technical assistance in an ongoing way to ensure that they were applying consistent definitions for a false report. In addition, a random sample of cases was checked for data entry errors. They then go on to cite several studies conducted outside of the US, and once again, these findings are very significant. A 3-year study in Australia found that of 812 rapes with evidence to investigate, only 2.1% of these reports were deemed false, with these complainants then being charged or threatened with charges. And another study examined the 116 rapes investigated by the Toronto Police Department in 1970 and found that only 7 of these cases, 6% of the total reports, were false. But the most significant collection of studies that I wanted to highlight came out of Britain. In 1992, 1996, and 2005, the British Home Office sponsored studies into the prevalence of rape reports. The results were as follows. In 1992, 348 rape cases from 1985 were examined. Using a combination of forensic evidence and testimonies of those involved, it was discovered that 8.3% of these allegations were false. In 1996, 483 cases were examined, and it was determined that 10.9% of reports were deemed false. Now, this is significant, but not for the reason you think. It's then explained that these conclusions were reached solely by the police, and that these conclusions were reached because there was no systemic means to determine what makes a false report. Once again, the biases of those examining these cases have inflated their perception of how frequent false reports actually are, and this is a fact that's corroborated by the third study sponsored by the Home Office in 2005. This study examined 2,643 reported sexual assaults reported to British police over a 15-year time period. Of these, 8% were classified as false. However, once again, this was the result of the police department making subjective judgments about things like the victim's mental illness, inconsistency in statements, and substance abuse. This means that these classifications were made in direct violation of department policy, which stated that in order for a report to be deemed false, there must be either a clear and credible admission by the complainant or strong evidential grounds. This meant that when researchers went back to investigate all sorts of additional data, like forensic reports, questionnaires, interviews, and analyses of statements, the percentage of reports deemed false fell from 8% to 2%. So, all things considered, it really does appear that the issue of false accusations is being overblown, when biases are ignored in favour of an approach that's substantiated with, evidence. The rate of false accusations falls dramatically. Now, again, this isn't to say that false accusations never happen, but you have to wonder why people are so ready to artificially inflate the statistics to discredit almost half of the people who come forward. So, let's have a look at where this resistance to the more reliable figures comes from. A lot of the pushback against the 2 to 10% statistic seems to be rooted in subjective opinions rather than a respect for the numbers. To show you what I mean, I wanted to go back to that Reddit thread from earlier. This person admits their own bias by claiming that they went to a community created for men to share their experiences of being falsely accused of any crime. Here's how they describe it. I found support for the accused, and while this subreddit wasn't just for men being falsely accused of sexual assault, it did have quite a few posts from men who had their lives ruined. To me, that looks a lot more than 2%. And I found this interesting because of how revealing it was. This person sought out a community that exclusively discusses these issues and then cited how many posts there were about those issues in one place in order to point out how common they are in general society. That's like going to the Tour de France and thinking, man, the average population is really good at cycling. And of course, this same sentiment is reflected in their research. One source they cite is very boldly titled, "That 2 to 10% statistic is extremely misleading," which sounds promising as a critique, for sure, until you realise that this paper does little more than say, this percentage of cases was proven false. We have no idea how common they really are, so don't use the 2 to 10 stat because it might be way higher. It's the same for this YouTube video by Freedom Tunes, a political animated... comedy show with values as outdated as their animation and over 900,000 subscribers. Their video on this statistic, which is the most popular I've seen on this topic with over 300,000 views, makes the same claim.
To assume that only 2 to 10% of rape accusations are false because only 2 to 10% are proven false would be as silly as assuming that only a small percentage of rape accusations are true because only a small percentage are proven to be true.
But this is misguided. It relies on the presumption that false and true claims have an equally likely chance of occurring, which, as we've already covered, isn't true. Making the claim that we just don't know does nothing but deny the very real historical instances where societal attitudes towards rape victims as liars or clout chasers or any other such harmful outlook has resulted in real and direct harm. This ignoring of history is only further demonstrated by the Washington Times article this Redditor cites, the same article that they got the 40% claim from. It's here that this article's author cites a 2017 book written by one Brent E. Turvey titled False Allegations, Investigative and Forensic Issues in Fraudulent Reports, as part of their discrediting the 2% claim. And I briefly wanted to dedicate some time to this book because it's some of the most recent literature we have on this topic. Not that you would know that if you actually read it though, because this book is some of the most embarrassingly written, poorly reasoned excuse for research I think I've ever seen. Turvey begins his examination of the history of false sexual assault allegations with an anecdote from the Bible. False reports of sexual assault are nothing new. They have been a part of documented history for thousands of years. Consider the biblical example of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. He then goes on to clarify this statement, claiming that this example, although ancient and unsubstantiated, is representative of a particular source of false allegations still encountered in the modern age, the spurned lover. It is significant that a text written thousands of years ago includes this example, likely to serve as a cautionary tale. It also tells us that this is a very old problem. This is what I mean when I say that this cultural attitude is the result of long-running ideas that have been ingrained in us without substantiation. Turvey unironically cites the Bible, the result of regressive attitudes from 2,000 years ago, as a reflection of the modern day. It's wildly inappropriate and speaks to the confirmation bias that runs rampant throughout his book. For a more concrete example of Turvey's negligence, I want to skip forward a few pages where he attempts to discredit the 2% statistic, claiming, quote, "There is no shortage of politicians, victims advocates, and news articles claiming that the nationwide false report for rape and sexual assault is almost non-existent, presenting a figure of around 2%. This figure is not only inaccurate, but also it has no basis in reality. Reporting it publicly as a valid frequency rate with any empirical basis is either scientifically negligent or fraudulent." So there we go, he believes that the 2% stat is scientifically negligent, and he goes on to cite the efforts of a researcher who tried to find the source for the 2% claim to no avail. And this should sound pretty strange to you, right? Because we know that there was a study that provided the 2% figure. The Third Home Office study from 2005. You know, the one which at the time of its publication was the largest and most comprehensive study ever conducted on the topic. How could he have missed this? Well, a key piece of the puzzle falls into place when you realise that this entire section debunking the 2% stat comes from a paper written by a man named Dick Hawes in 1997. Now, of course, it's perfectly reasonable that Mr. Hawes wouldn't have known about this study considering it hadn't been conducted yet. But what's Turvey's excuse? He had 12 years to learn that this study and its results existed. The charitable thing would be to attribute this to laziness or a general lack of care. It would explain a lot of the weird little errors that pervade this book, like when he misspells the word every as ever, which, I mean, not to be pedantic, but if you're writing a book about such a serious topic, you should probably put a bit more care into it, right? But to be honest, I'm not quite content to let him off the hook that easily either, because painting Turvey as some incompetent idiot only undermines the very active steps that he's taking to lie in this paper. After critiquing the 2% myth, as he calls it, Turvey goes on to highlight some research that he finds more credible, which puts the number anywhere between 8 and 41%. Yeah, he also cites Kanin, go figure. We're really getting a lot of miles out of that one academic study, aren't we? But what caught my eye was the fact that Turvey also cited a study written by David Lisak, who, as we already know, has contributed to much criticism of Kanin's study. Of course, he frames it as 5.9% being much higher than 2%, but I was still confused. And I was even more confused when I looked further down the list and saw 3 names that I immediately recognized: Lonsway, Archambault, and Lisak. Those names in that order should be memorable to you because those are the authors of a paper I've already covered, False Reports, the paper that discredits Kanin's study that Turvey goes on to cite in his book, the same paper that cites the 2005 Home Office study that arrived at a number of 2%. So what does this mean? It means that Turvey has cited a paper that completely and utterly discredits the central thesis of this chapter. Not only are his sources outright discrediting one another, they're completely at odds with everything he's said up until this point, and prove him to be nothing more than a dirty liar. He's so willing to discredit the 2% statistic that he's willing to cite any paper with a higher number, even if it inadvertently reveals that the 2% stat does exist and is based on solid research. Brent, what was your goal here, man? The lies don't end here either. Turvey cites another study that also provides a figure of 41% from 2004, and this was striking to me because I'd not heard of it before, and it's substantially more up to date than Kanin's paper, and maybe more reliable too, so I went and found it. Beyond Belief is a 2004 article published by Jan Jordan from Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand, examining police attitudes towards victims of rape. Halfway through the article, Jordan cites police files that she gained access to, describing them as being split into separate categories, determined largely by police perceptions of legitimacy of the complaint. And it's here that Turvey gets the 41% statistic. But there's a problem. Only 8% of the total accusations were admitted to be false by the person who made the report. The remaining 33% were judged by the police to have been fabricated. What proof did they have? Well, they just reckoned it was fabricated due to the circumstances under which it occurred. Things like the victim being in an impaired state of mind, having had previous consensual encounters with the offender, and having previously filed a rape report. In essence, these police officers just decided that these complainants were lying, and in many cases decided to halt all investigations as a result. This is what Jordan was trying to illustrate in this article, that victims of rape aren't taken seriously in the investigative process, and this lack of care ends up inflating our perception of how common false accusations of rape really are, leading to a world where women's stories of sexual assault are, well, beyond belief. Remember the Rideout Case? A rapist was allowed to walk free because his victim was discredited, treated like she had a severe sexual problem, and subjected to mockery and derision by those that had already made up their minds about her. Jan Jordan says it best here. Many rape complainants must still battle to gain credibility in the eyes of some police investigative officers, and that stereotypically based judgments continue to impact negatively on police perceptions and decision making. That's from the abstract. Turvey couldn't even be bothered to read the abstract to know what Jordan was trying to accomplish by citing these numbers. Instead of seeing these numbers as the result of a biased justice system that feeds into an anti-victim narrative and perpetuates a culture of victim blaming, he just sees a number that he agrees with and plucks it for use in his paper. That's fucking outrageous. But it makes sense when you consider that Turvey himself also thinks that a victim's past should impact their credibility when filing a rape report. He's so desperate to call rape victims into question that he's willing to completely ignore the context of the statistics that he cites. And then he has the gall to cite Jan Jordan's paper as the source of a high amount of false accusations, when the point of her paper is to show how unfounded these perceptions are. What a disgusting slap in the face to Jan Jordan's work to expose these problems, as well as every single victim she was trying to do right by. And I'm expected to pay $75 for this sloppily edited, poorly argued, dishonest bullshit excuse for research? Fuck you, Brent. This is indicative of how a lot of rape skeptics argue their point. Brent just plucked a bunch of numbers that suited him and uncritically dumped them in a book hoping that you wouldn't notice. It's dishonesty, masquerading as research, playing at the idea of critical thinking. Their arguments are rooted in these cultural biases that they fail to examine and instead use as citations, which then go on to further shape biased cultural attitudes, and the cycle continues. And of course, this carries over into broader society. To show you what I mean, I want to point our attention away from the research towards those whose opinions it shapes. Let's take a look at YouTuber Frank Steven and how he tackles the problem of false accusations in his video, Nigerian Destroys Feminist Ridiculous Claim. What are we, back in 2016? Jesus Christ.
Men are quite literally more likely to be hit by a comet than be falsely accused of rape.
Madam, I'm sure you know at least one man who's been falsely accused of rape. But can you mention one person who's been hit by a comet? See, if you want to lie, you take it easy. Try not to make it too obvious, or better yet, just tell the truth. I mean, you are part of the reason we don't believe all women.
So what's going on here? This person that Frank is responding to is citing an article that lists 5 things you're more likely to experience than a false accusation. It's since been debunked for a faulty application of statistics, so we'll accept that this lady is wrong in the claim that she makes. But I briefly wanted to highlight the rhetorical cowardice in what Frank says in response.
I'm sure you know at least one man who's been falsely accused of rape.
Nah. Frank doesn't really cite any concrete studies to back this up. He just reckons it's true and encourages his viewers to think the same, which of course they do handily. This is, of course, an attitude that's remained prevalent, from the Rideout Case to Kanin's study all the way to the people citing it. People believe that false accusations are common, and so everything has to be shoehorned into that predetermined conclusion, even if you have to lie to get there. This is further demonstrated by another video Frank released titled Nigerian Offers a Solution to False Rape Accusation.
We all know how easily false allegations of severe sexual misconduct can ruin a man's life. I mean, even a non-consensual handshake can turn you into a social pariah, a HR nightmare, or worse, a convict.
And again, we can see the rampant dishonesty that permeates videos like this. It doesn't matter that there are literally no documented cases of someone being convicted for this, because that's not what's important. What's important is the sentiment behind it, which is, of course, that false accusations are common, which Frank is desperate to convince his audience is true. So desperate, in fact, that he outright lies about the news stories he cites. You probably saw this headline that claimed that someone was imprisoned for a false accusation, which Frank cites as an example of someone having their life ruined. But this isn't the case, because the person arrested was the person who made the false report. He didn't even try to hide it. He just flashes the headline on the screen long enough for you to register the word convicted so that it seems like he's not spreading total bullshit to his audience. Hey Frank, I have some advice for you.
If you want to lie, you take it easy. Try not to make it too obvious, or better yet, just tell the truth.
The truth doesn't matter to these people. They only care about what they can use to reaffirm what they already think. It's very frustrating that this crowd, who love to cite slogans like facts over feelings and whatever else, love to dismiss the facts because it protects their feelings. But Frank doesn't need to care about the facts. He just needs to tell his audience what they want to hear, and that's enough. They ignore the accurate statistics and facts because they think they know better. And they think they know better because the issue of false accusations has become something of a self-sustaining phenomenon. People believe that they're common, so they look at every rape report through that lens, skewing their perception of what a rape report actually looks like. So, what does an actual rape report look like? In False Reports, Lonsway and Archambault take pains to point out the traits of what society considers to be a real rape. They describe it as follows. If you were to ask a room full of people what they thought sexual assault looked like, you might get some answers like the following. The victim and suspect don't know each other. There was a weapon involved. There are signs of physical injury. The victim is hysterical and files a report immediately. The victim didn't exercise bad judgment at the time of the assault. They've never reported an assault in the past, and the suspect is of a bad reputation. I'm sure you've seen some crime procedural that uses these exact qualities, and this is because it plays into a societal stereotype of what we think rape looks like, and can often shape perceptions of how we think a credible rape report should then be made. They then list some traits of what society thinks happens during an investigation that also makes the victim seem credible. Things like there being a lot of physical evidence, the victim actively participating with the investigation, the victim being certain and consistent regarding the details, the victim not recanting, and the victim not lying at any point of the investigative process. These are all the expected norm during rape investigations and play into the societal idea of what a real rape looks like. In contrast, there are, of course, several traits or qualities that people look out for in order to determine if an accusation is false. In a separate document, Lonsway and Archambault list several red flags, as they describe them, that often cause people to be hesitant of the credibility of a rape report. Things like the victim and the suspect knowing each other, the victim having a history of mental health issues or struggles with addiction, a lack of cooperation from the victim changing details of what happened or being vague about them, and even sometimes making claims that are provably false, and the suspect being someone with a lot of credibility or esteem. You can directly observe this in Turvey's book, wherein he lists a bunch of reasons a person filing a report may lose credibility, including a history of mental illness, drug addiction, or any other affliction that can alter someone's perception of reality. However, as Lonsway and Archambault go on to point out, these are some of the most realistic dynamics of rape as it actually occurs. But people will treat these very common traits as cause for alarm or disbelief, when in reality it's a more accurate representation of what an actually real rape looks like. To be fair to Turvey, he doesn't say that these traits should lead to a case being outright dismissed, simply that they should be cause for further investigation and scrutiny. But my question is, how? We've already covered how hesitant victims are to continue with the investigative process if they feel they're not being believed or treated with credibility. To perpetuate that because they don't fit your idea of what a credible rape victim looks like is horrible. But time and time again, we see the exact same story of this exact same thing happening. A society that's formed an inaccurate view of what rape looks like, using that inaccuracy to brush off a rape report and not take those involved seriously. And sometimes, if the society is confident enough in their faulty understanding of what real rape looks like, it can become a national scandal. In July 2018, Donald Trump nominated Brent Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court of the United States. Later that month, an allegation of sexual assault against him was made public. Several more followed in the upcoming weeks, each with varying degrees of severity and substantiation. The initial accuser, Christine Blasey Ford, as well as Kavanaugh, both ended up testifying before the Senate in a 4-day hearing, presenting their stories to determine the outcome of Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court. A week later, Kavanaugh was confirmed in a vote of 48 to 50. And look, I'm not going to claim that he did it or didn't do it, because ultimately I don't know. What I will claim, and what I absolutely can substantiate, is the fact that the entire investigation surrounding these allegations was poisoned from the start, from biased, ill-informed perspectives of what a legitimate rape accusation actually looks like. For instance, the Washington Times article cited in the original Reddit post. This is where I originally learned of the existence of both Kanin's study as well as Turvey's book. This article is nothing more than an attempt to discredit Ford's accusations and defend Kavanaugh, and its author, Rowan Scarborough, isn't squeamish about clutching at any straws he can reach in order to do it. For instance, most of the article is straight up copy-pasted from Turvey's book, which, as we've already covered, isn't the most reliable source of information. But it doesn't end there. He also cites so-called false reports within the US military, making the claim that nearly 1/4 of all cases last year were thrown out for lack of evidence, according to a report released in May. But once again, a lack of evidence doesn't mean that no rape occurred. This is exactly what Lonsway and Archambault were talking about with their red flags framework. People will readily dismiss a report of rape because it doesn't match the impression they already have of it. This is an attitude repeated again and again. The idea that if a story doesn't match your faulty understanding of what rape is, then it didn't happen. During her testimony before the Senate, Ford was asked what she remembered the most about the incident. Her response? That the person who had assaulted her, as well as his friend who was also in the room at the time, were both laughing as it happened.
Indelible in the hippocampus is the laughter, the uproarious laughter between the two, and they're having fun at my expense.
She also described how she didn't remember certain things, such as how she got to the party or where it took place.
I truly wish I could be more helpful with more detailed answers to all of the questions that have and will be asked about how I got to the party and where it took place and so forth. I don't have all the answers, and I don't remember as much as I would like to.
Now, remember, this isn't anything out of the ordinary for people who have experienced a rape. It's very well documented that victims forget certain details or get mixed up on the facts, as we already saw. This alone isn't proof that her story was fabricated. But, of course, society doesn't view rape through the lens of literature or what's really true. Instead, it relies on easy-to-digest stereotypes that match the picture you already have in your head. It relies on what it thinks a real rape is, regardless of what a real rape actually looks like. So, of course, this lack of memory was immediately weaponized against Ford's testimony. On the 2nd of October 2018, Donald Trump took to the podium at one of his rallies. It was there that he offered his own perspective on Ford's account.
I had one beer, right? I had one beer. Well, do you think it was? Nope, it was one beer. Oh, good. How did you get home? I don't remember. How'd you get there? I don't remember. Where is the place? I don't remember. How many years ago was it? I don't know. I don't know. What neighborhood was it in? I don't know. Where's the house? I don't know.
And once again, none of what Trump is mocking Ford for is a strong enough reason to discredit her entire story. She forgot some details. That's incredibly common for people who've experienced a traumatic event. It doesn't prove anything. And I just briefly want to talk about the broader societal implications of this clip. Donald Trump, then President of the United States, citing a flawed understanding of what a rape accusation looks like in order to discredit someone who came forward with an account that closely resembles most credible accusations. This achieves nothing except reinforcing lazy, harmful stereotypes that completely skew our understanding of what rape actually is most of the time and prevents victims being taken seriously. Worse than that, though, is how his government actively hindered the investigation into Ford's accusations. Let's go back to that Washington Times article. You know, the article that was written with the express purpose of discrediting Kavanaugh's accusers. This article cites Turvey's book, which has some pretty interesting ideas about the investigative process. Turvey makes the claim that the single most important element of any rape investigation is the interview with the victim, which of course makes sense, and makes it all the more shocking that this was never done. Ford and Kavanaugh were never directly interviewed by the FBI, despite the willingness of Ford's attorneys and even Ford herself. Another of Kavanaugh's accusers, Deborah Ramirez, reported that while she'd been interviewed for 2 hours, her list of 20 potential witnesses to her story was never taken seriously. Trump's White House, who the FBI answered to in this investigation, had control over which witnesses the FBI was allowed to interview. They claimed that Ford and Kavanaugh's sworn statements before the Senate were enough, but I have to briefly contest this. As part of the hearings, Democrat and Republican senators each alternated in questioning Ford and Kavanaugh in 5-minute increments. Republican senators hired sex crimes prosecutor Rachel Mitchell to do the questioning for them. She was a vocal critic of this stilted, piece-by-piece interview structure.
Would you believe me if I told you that there's no study that says that this setting in 5-minute increments is the best way to do that?
We'll stipulate for that.
We can stipulate for that.
Thank you, counsel.
Agreed.
Did you know that the best way to do it is to have a trained interviewer talk to you one-on-one in a private setting and to let you do the talking, just let you do a narrative?
This is, ironically enough, something that could have been solved by a private FBI interview of both parties involved, which, once again, is cause for some concern as to why this never happened. But It becomes a lot more revealing once you consider the other shortcomings of this investigation. As part of the investigative process into the allegations, a tip line was set up by the FBI. They received a total of 4,500. All the relevant tips, including those that corroborated the stories of Kavanaugh's accusers, were forwarded to Trump's White House. That's where the investigation ended. A White House secretary responded to criticism of the investigation's limitations, claiming that the Senate had determined how far the investigation could go. A former FBI agent later contrasted these claims and stated that the parameters of the investigation are determined solely by the White House. And then, as we already saw, Kavanaugh was later confirmed to the Supreme Court. This is a damning indication of societal attitudes towards rape victims to this very day. Christine Blasey Ford had to stand in front of the Senate on live television in front of millions of people and recount an incredibly traumatic experience. She said herself that she was terrified to be there.
I am here today not because I want to be. I am terrified.
And what happened? People made fun of her for having a shaky voice, they sent her death threats, and they treated her with disbelief because her story, which accurately reflects most credible rape accusations, didn't match the lazy, culturally ingrained stereotypes that many people think rape is. This bias was then used as fuel by Donald Trump, the President of the United States, and a man with a fair few rape accusations himself, to mock Ford's testimony in front of all of his supporters and skew an FBI investigation in his and his nominee's favour. It's a horrific institutional failure that came from a faulty understanding of what rape is and the trauma it causes. It's the result of those in power either not caring to re-examine their internal biases towards this issue or actively ignoring it to their own benefit and allowing the problem to continue. It's what feminists mean by rape culture. This is an issue that's observable in everything I've gone through in this video. The issue of false accusations is so trivially rare compared to the wider system at play that treats victims with inherent skepticism and blame for no credible reason. Time and time again in the research I've covered, we see the same story. From the lazily constructed Kanin study to Turvey's joke of a book to the YouTubers who parrot their talking points, we keep treating societal misconceptions as fact to then reinforce those same misconceptions with the appearance of objectivity. And then that same corrupted information allows institutional failures like the Rideout verdict, all the way to the horrendously one-sided Kavanaugh investigation, both of which brought up an accuser's sexual history in an attempt to discredit their stories. There were 40 years between these two trials, and the cultural attitude that shames victims based on shit that doesn't matter is still very much alive. I didn't make this video to say that false accusations never happen. I made this video because the discussion surrounding false accusations has become a weapon of rape culture. That Reddit post is a prime example of how easily people fall for misinformation, so long as it fits into their pre-existing worldview at the expense of those who do come forward with their stories. These people talk about how easy life would be if they could make up statistics to suit their agenda like feminists do, not realizing that the studies they cite to back up their own worldview do this exact thing. And they talk of feminism being rooted in feelings and ignoring objective data, all the while citing papers that ignore the most comprehensive research on false accusations because it actively disproves the point they want to make. To me, these comments represent the next generation of rape culture. They perpetuate an attitude that ignores how common of an issue rape is, instead relying on a wildly unsubstantiated disbelief that fits their worldview. I mentioned at the very start of the video that I've been seeing more and more of an anti-accuser stance, and this has been a continuous process throughout the entire history of false accusations discourse. We need to recognize when we have these ingrained biases that skew our perception of societal issues and interrogate them accordingly. Otherwise, things will be the same another 40 years from now. I don't have some tidy one-liner to wrap everything up in a neat little bow. It doesn't feel right to do that with this video anyway. Instead, I would ask you to please consider donating to one of the charities I've linked below in the pinned comment. The Survivors Trust is a UK and Ireland-based charity, and RAIN is based in the US. These charities are both focused on helping survivors and reforming the justice system that should, in an ideal world, be helping them. So that seems like a good place to start. In the meantime, make sure to always question the assumptions you take for granted. I'm guilty of having opinions I don't always interrogate, but it's important to be aware of this fact and at least try to approach them with an open mind. You don't have to be an academic or a scholar or H-bomber guy to get to the bottom of these assumptions and realize that they're unfounded. All you have to do is realize that they do exist and that you aren't immune to them and care to make a change. If we do that, maybe we'll be on the right path. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time.